All right. Thank you for coming back to another episode of Psych Your Way to Success. I am Claire Bike, and with me, as always,
Heather Fife.
And today we have a special treat. We have Courtney Shrum, a licensed counselor within Washington State, actually. And thanks again for being here, Courtney. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. We get to talk today about another mental health in the workplace topic, which we'll let Courtney kind of dive into and explain what direction she's going to take that. But again, really excited to have you here on today and talk a little bit more about what it's like to be in the workforce right now. So let's have you take it away for a minute.
Yeah. So to give a little bit on like my background as well, I actually worked in business and tech for a decade, and I just straight up burned out, and my soul was dying, and I was not happy, and I knew like I needed to pivot and get out, and that was a personal choice for me, and I actually I pivoted out and got a degree in kinesiology, which is exercise related sciences, and worked as a coach for a few years, and really through my experience with that found like, oh, coaching people is way more about mental health than it is physical health. Like, yes, it's easy, to know how to coach people. It's easy to figure out like how to move your body and do all these things, but the sort of magnitude of what people bring with them in terms of what's on their mind, what motivates them, what comes up is really where I got into like, okay, I'm going to go back to school and get my degree in mental health counseling. And so that's how I ended up here. But also just wanted to plug like, I have been in business. Like, I get it. I know what it's all about. I know like the pain points. I know all those sorts of things. So it's definitely, it's an interesting sort of intersection for me to get to talk more about today. And really like, I get the advantage of hearing a lot of what my clients talk about. And, part of that tends to be about what's going on in their workplace as well. And so like, a few of the things that I'm really seeing in terms of what's coming up for people right now is like burnout is just huge. It's everywhere. It's, we tend to grind as hard as we can and then wonder why we're so exhausted and then fight against ourselves because we're
American
exhausted.
Way.
Yeah.
Isn't that the American dream? We work our 20 hours and then go home.
Yes, exactly. And so there's no real awareness over like something that I see quite a bit is like people don't have a really general sense or good idea of like what their true capacity is. And that makes sense, right? Because they've been told their entire lives, like, oh no, you're going to go work 5 days a week for 40 hours and sometimes more. And that's just going to be like what you do. And it can be so hard because some people like honestly struggle with that. And understandably too, like we're human beings, we're not robots. We can't just be programmed to do. Yeah, I know. It's weird.
I have some CEOs that would love to disagree with you right now.
Yeah. Totally fair. But like we run up against this thing where it's just like we get exhausted and then we get frustrated with ourselves because we're exhausted and we don't give ourselves credit for like, oh, maybe I'm just a human and this is too much and I need to step back and take space and like take care of myself. And so like this creates sort of this really negative, space in their mental health. And like they start to tear themselves down because they don't understand why they can't sort of live up to this ideal that's coming up for them.
I find that funny because, I mean, obviously, I don't know about you, Heather, but I'm finding a lot of what Courtney's saying to be true for probably a lot of my work life that I experienced, like tearing myself down. But would you say, like, so that's one of, so your top 3 things that you're maybe seeing, Courtney, what would that look like?
Yeah. So burnout is definitely like the biggest one. The second one, there's been a lot of sort of readjusting as I'm seeing, like people are getting pulled back into office. So when we, when COVID happened, quarantine hit, like a bunch of businesses pivoted and, let workers be remote. And overall, like it seemed like that was an okay pivot and people were able to sort of work through that. But it feels like a bigger stressor now is like companies are starting to bring people back into office and like, working their way up towards sort of a full work week back in office again. And there's a lot of stress that's coming from that because people truly have gotten used to like, oh, I'm working from home, so like I can figure out my life better that way, or like it's less stressful because I have access to like, my kitchen or my bathroom or like my pets,
Or I'm not
whatever
driving
that
in
might.
traffic.
Exactly. And so now, like, you're getting hit again with these stressors of like, okay, what's traffic going to look like? Where do I park? How do I sit in an office for 8 hours a day? Like these things that maybe we took for granted for so long before and didn't even think about, but now it's like a huge readjustment to have to come back.
Yeah,
Um,
I can see that also like with their pets or
yeah.
their kids, because I think like your pets are also used to you now being home. And so
Hmm.
that's hard to like leave them or your kids. Like they're used to, even though you're working, you're still technically home when they get home.
Exactly.
Well, and we
Yeah.
even saw the uptick in foster. So I foster sometimes, and
Hmm.
huge uptick on like we had empty shelters for a while during
Yeah.
COVID, and now we have almost overflowing shelters again. So yeah, please continue. Sorry. Great
Yeah,
point.
No,
sorry. I didn't mean
it's
to like interrupt. It's just
Until
no, this
very
is good.
what
Like
fascinating
it's
can it
so
topic.
be?
true. Obviously, it's resonating to some degree. Um, and so yeah, like the third one, I would say, like it feels like there's maybe this disconnect or lack of understanding with sort of choices that leadership is making currently. And so, like using the example coming back to office, it feels like there's sort of a disconnect where like some companies may have built buildings to support workers or like have leased or rented or whatever it is to support a workforce, and then like they're like, oh, to some degree we might as well use it, and so they're bringing people back in, but like it feels like there's some disconnect between like what the people actually want and like what leadership is saying to everyone. And
Hmm.
so like there's stress with that too, of just like I don't feel connected to my leadership anymore. They're not paying attention to my needs as an employee.
Agreed. You know what? In fact, one of my friends, she gets this, I don't know, email, letter, whatever, however they decided to disseminate the information. And it just said RTO. And she didn't even know what that meant.
Yeah.
And she was just like, and it caused so much stress and almost like she said it blew up the employee chat where it
Mm-hmm.
was just like, that's so rude. We don't want
Yeah.
to come back. Like, and they just started using the terms like RTO obviously is return to
Return to
office.
us.
Right.
I mean,
I
but
was
the
going to take
stress,
time off. What?
but the stress it caused on her was crazy
Mm-hmm.
because she was just like
Yeah.
having to search like what RTO meant. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah.
agree with that disconnect where from a leadership perspective, they're learning about how to get your employees to return to the office. And so
Mm-hmm.
they've been probably talking about it for months. And then they disseminate the information as if everybody's been a part of these conversations.
Yeah. Exactly. And the way like it's being communicated, it from what I've heard, it sounds like it's more of being mandated and less of like being a conversation. So it just feels like, oh, you're making this decision for me. Like there's no more autonomy. Like
Yeah.
it is just you're making this decision. I guess I'm gonna have to figure it out. Like it's gonna impact so many different things in my life. And like that's causing a lot of distress for people of just like I don't feel like I trust my leadership if they're not even willing to like tell me what's going on, why I'm coming back, what's the point, like when there can be so many advantages to not doing that people have found truly at this point.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into this because I think we talked about how we might do that.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as like we talked a little bit about maybe like the nervous system and the responses that we have as people to this level of stress, to these
Absolutely.
constant stressors that I think we're seeing people come
Yeah,
under in this period of their life in the workplace. What does that look like?
absolutely. And so it's important to recognize like we are constantly going to face distress or chaos or whatever it might be in our lives. And this is a really important thing, like I talk about in therapy with my clients, is like you're not here so that like we can work together and you're suddenly happy 100% of the time. Like that's not realistic.
Right.
That's not human. That's like it's not going to happen. So it's like just sort of level setting. Honestly, when people come to therapy, it's more about, you're going to be happy and that's great, but like, what happens when you're in those low moments? What happens when you're stressed? What happens when you're just distressed? Like, being able to recognize what's going on and react in a way that's supportive for you is the biggest takeaway you'll ever get from like truly working with a therapist to some
Coping skills.
degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I talk about that, a big component in working through your own stress or distress is really starting to like touch a little bit more into your nervous system. And so to give a little background on the nervous system, we have, like different branches and parts, but the biggest part to focus on is something called the autonomic nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system is automatic. We don't have a huge amount of control over what it's doing or why, but it breaks down into two very specific parts. So you have your sympathetic nervous system, which is your flight or fight mode, and your parasympathetic nervous system, which is what they call the rest or digest side. And so you can start to, recognize and play with some of this in terms of knowledge and awareness of yourself over like where you're falling. And so if you're starting to feel stress, and it doesn't have to be, I like to say like, a tiger doesn't have to be chasing you in order for your fight or flight mode to kick on. And the sooner you can really understand that, the better off you'll be, because sometimes people are like, what is wrong with me? Why am I like freaking out? Why am I anxious? Why am I panicking? Why am I depressed? And like, to me, the answer truly often comes back to what is going on in your nervous system right now. And so when you're feeling the stress of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to return back to office, or like I feel disconnected from my leadership, or whatever that might be in your workplace, your sympathetic nervous system is actually like, it's kicking on. Your fight or flight mode is kicking on to some degree because you are feeling a stressor, and that nervous system, that part of your nervous system is there to like protect you, because you're giving an indicator that like, oh, I need some sort of protection right now that's coming up for me. That is what stress does to our body. And so the sooner we can sort of like start to pay attention to like, oh, how can I key into my nervous system in this moment and start to tell like what's going on, what's coming up specifically with this stress, the better off we can truly be sometimes at like adapting to these stressors and being able to handle them and feeling more in control, rather than sort of, panicking and thinking we're crazy or like what's wrong with us because like I can't handle this, stress of going back to office. And so that's truly like when I say, the nervous system in the workplace, that's what I'm starting to think about is like, when is it coming online for you? What does that look like? And how do you know?
Are there, oh, go ahead,
Oh,
Heather. Yep.
this is
All the
so
questions we
fascinating.
have. I know. Ready.
I know, right? So what you're saying is what you do is you to like calm down the sympathetic nervous system is by just asking questions like, what is going on? What is coming up for me? Is it like talking to somebody, or can you just do it on yourself, like journal about it? Or like, what do you find is the most productive way to like handle that?
And so, like, to answer that, the first thing I always tell any client is like the biggest key to your mental health is awareness. And like that's it. You just have to be aware of what is going on, because we are so like programmed to run on autopilot mode. And our subconscious just takes it and it runs with it, and whatever has been programmed into that is just like it's flowing. And so like if we're not paying attention to like, what is this pattern that's coming up for me? Or what is this reaction that's coming up for me related to, a return to office notice? We're just going to react the way like we've been programmed to react, which is, for some people, a huge increase in anxiety. For some people, it's depression. For some people, it's panic. For some people, whatever that looks like for you specifically. But like the key place to start is truly like, where do you build that awareness? How can I start to notice like, okay, so I got this notification that I'm returning back to office. I'm noticing a lot of anxiety coming up. And so if I use myself as an example, like I tend to, if I'm having a sympathetic reaction, go straight into flight mode. Like my body wants to run. I want to be out of there 110%. So like for me, I notice like I'll start to get fidgety. Like my legs will start bouncing, and like I'll just notice like sort of that urge of like I need to get up and move, I need to get up and do something. Like I can't sit still. And so
That's
that would be a really key moment for me to be like, oh, there's something coming up now.
I think that as you're saying that, anybody listening would absolutely be able to recognize, like,
Yeah.
oh, wait a minute. Like, because I know my shoulders tense up, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
I
That's a
can't, like,
huge
I can
one.
barely move my neck sometimes. Like, if I
Mm-hmm.
let it go too far, that's what happens. But yeah, like, Heather, do you have a tell that you can think of right now?
I know. I was like trying to think of, I think I get fidgety. Like, I don't even
Yeah.
want to like,
Hmm.
I think fidgety is the right word. Is anxiety kind of the same thing? Is that similar or is that a little different?
It's a great question.
Yeah. So anxiety, it's kind of like when you have a really intentional increase in like nervous energy. And so, like, oftentimes people talk about, like, in your mind, it feels like, okay, I'm worrying about a lot of things. And I also like to delineate between, like, you can be naturally nervous about something. Like, okay, you're about to stand up and give a big speech. I wouldn't necessarily call that anxiety. I would call that just like nervousness. Like, you're
Hmm.
nervous. That's understandable. That is fully human for you to be like worried because you're about to have like a really big speech and feel nervous about it. Anxiety is more like I'm nervous about everything. I'm worried about everything. I'm thinking about my future, you know, tomorrow, 10 years from now, whatever that is. But my mind just is constantly trying to plan for what's coming next because it doesn't feel safe to some degree. And that's usually a learned pattern of like, when it doesn't feel safe, I need to plan for it. And so that's
And
really where anxiety starts to come in and show up quite a bit.
would you say even that when people are saying like it doesn't feel safe, that at some point, even when it could feel safe, you're still planning because you've learned
Yes,
that you have to anyway? Like it's
absolutely.
just a constant like because so is that kind of when we get into more of the long-term anxiety complexes? Is that more of what
Absolutely.
that is?
It
Oh,
can
okay.
be. Yeah. And yes, you can start talking about like neural pathways. So what's been reinforced?
Right.
So
Yep.
if you are anxious and then you plan something and then you feel better, that's going to be very reinforced for you and tougher to break than someone who's like anxious and then they plan something and then nothing comes from it.
Right.
So like, paying attention to like, oh, is that like a pattern I fall into of like planning and then it feels good and then I'm okay. And so your body will it'll actually start to stress you out. So you will do that loop and
Oh,
then
wow.
plan for it because that's the only way it knows, oh, I can come back down from that and relax.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of mind-blowing
Yeah.
when you sit in that for a minute. I used to be
Yeah.
the type of person where I felt like I was going to get fired every day.
Yep.
And I mean, it's a job hazard, but it's funny that you reckon that your first point, like your first thing for people to do out there is kind of like what I would say in my old profession and my current profession is called hazard recognition. So you
Right.
have to be aware of the hazards in order to be able to mitigate the hazards, right?
Exactly.
So that first step is, you know, hazard recognition. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other steps before, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. So building awareness is great. But the next step is always like, what are you going to do with it? Like, do you want to be a different version of yourself for showing up in this moment? And oftentimes that is what people want. Like, they don't necessarily want to be anxious, but how do you like show up in this moment as somebody who wouldn't be anxious? And then how do you sort of make bids for that sort of behavior and being able to show up as yourself that way? So, you're thinking about hazard recognition or like being in a situation where you're like, I'm anxious, I don't know what's coming next, so I'm going to plan for it. A lot of times, anxiety is truly a indicator of a lack of self-trust. And so when you don't trust yourself, you feel like, well, I don't trust I'm going to know what to do, so I need to figure it out beforehand and like have that prepared and ready to go. So part of this is like, if I'm going to put more bids into the bucket of like trusting myself, then you kind of step back and go, okay, whatever is going to happen, I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to trust like it's going to be good. And that can be a really interesting way to start to think about it of like, when you're in a situation, what sort of bids am I making in this moment? And for what version of myself am I making that for? Am I going to continue down this pathway of like being anxious and planning the future and like thinking about all that stuff, which to some degree you're going to do, and that's okay. But like, if you want to change that behavior, it becomes about, can I make a different bid here? Can I think, what would a confident version of me show up as right now? And what would that look like? And how can I be that person? Well, how can I embody that behavior rather than just falling into a pattern that you're used to?
That is a great point. Like, what would that look like if I was confident and I walked into this room? What would that look like?
Yeah.
I need to do that more often sometimes. Maybe less often other times. I don't know.
Sure.
Oh my God, so true, right? I'm the same way.
There's some rooms I just shouldn't step into. I'm not gonna lie. Oh man. Well, as we're wrapping up, this has been an insanely informative and very helpful session for me. So I hope you're not billing me for this. Thank you so much. But do you have any last bits of advice or anything that you would love to summarize with?
Absolutely. I think one of the other huge takeaways that I like to work with clients with is truly like, we tend to be in a society that's very judgmental. It's very black and white. It's very right or wrong. And the honest truth is we live in a world that is not that way. There is so much nuance. There is so much gray area. There is so much we have yet to understand that like a final takeaway for me would be like, how do you choose curiosity over judgment? How do you choose to pick and lean towards, I want to understand this thing rather than judge it as right or wrong? And so like that truly, like, those are the two big things I work with clients on: awareness and choosing curiosity over judgment. And just, noticing what happens to your mental health and your nervous system as a result of that.
Amazing. Heather, thoughts?
Oh my gosh, I'm just this was at such perfect timing. You put everything together in such a beautiful little package. I was just actually talking to my son about choosing curiosity over judgment. I didn't say it that eloquently. I'm going to send that exact thing to him. But I do think you're right. I think we do live in a world that there is so much gray area, and we're all such different human beings. So I think the biggest takeaway that I'm taking away from this is that we all get to do it our own way. And what's important is figuring out what our own way is, what our own triggers are. And when those do happen, what do we do? So we're prepared.
Yeah, it's accountability. It's ownership of how you show up. And that's important.
That evil A word.
Dang it.
Comes back around every time, almost every episode. No. Well, again, I can't thank you enough for being here, Courtney. I really, really appreciate everything, obviously. I know that I am 100% walking away, and I hope everybody else does today. Just being more aware of what is happening. And then obviously my favorite thing from today is going to be choosing curiosity over judgment. So thanks again. And just remember, if you guys have any questions, concerns, hit us up on LinkedIn or on YouTube. You can, again, find us on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, or YouTube. So have a wonderful day. And if you want to reach out to Courtney, do you have any location that you would prefer that they reach out to you on?
Yeah, you can definitely look at my website. It's called candorcounseling.co.co.
Okay.
I also have an Instagram profile, and you can find me there at Therapy with Court.
Excellent. And we'll put those in our description for the episode. So if you guys have any questions, it will be there. So reach out to Courtney or reach out to us and we'll help you get there. All right. Everybody have a good day. Happy holidays.
Okay.